Greetings. Don't forget to turn on subtitles if you have difficulties with understanding me. Today we are going to be talking about DAZ bridges. On the main page of the DAZ Studio website, there is a lot of information about the program itself. And here at the bottom, we can find the link for DAZ bridges. It redirects us to a dedicated page. Bridges allow for a fast and easy transfer of your assets from the DAZ Studio into another 3D design software. Here we can see all programs that have DAZ bridges available for them. In this video, we are going to be introducing the DAZ to Blender bridge and looking at its new update. But before anything else, we need to learn about Blender itself. It is a free 3D design software and it has its own website. Here we can learn a lot about Blender. For example, in the Features tab, you can learn about all the main functions of Blender. Things such as modeling, sculpting, animating and a lot more, even possibilities for scripting. Thanks to the DAZ to Blender bridge, DAZ Studio users now also have access to all these features. You can download Blender by going to the main page and pressing the download button. There is no need to even register. On the next page, we can see that Blender is not only free, but it is also open source. Here you can choose which version of Blender do you want to download. After this, it is your forever. Installing it is also this easy, just follow the instructions. If you have both DAZ Studio and Blender installed, you can proceed to install the bridge add-on itself. You can press on the add-on here and it should redirect you to the dedicated page. But you need to have a DAZ Studio account for this, but this should not be a problem. Alternatively, you can find this add-on in the shop. Just search for it in the search bar. On this page, we can again make sure that the add-on is, in fact, free. Also, here is where we get it from. You need to add it to your cart and then either proceed right to the checkout or access the cart from the top right at any moment later. Then you need to go through the process of buying this item, even though it is free. This includes providing your billing information. But if you ever used the Daz3D shop before, everything should be easy. After you've finished on the website, you need to install the add-on. The best way to do that is to open DAZ Central. As you can see, it discovered the add-on automatically and proposes to install it right away. If you don't have this window, then you should see your item on the dashboard in the Available Bridges section. Or also it can be accessed from the side panel here. Use any of the variants to install the bridge. Right now we installed it just into the DAZ Studio, but we also need to enable it in Blender. Open Blender. This is the scene that you should see after you first open it. Go to the Edit, Preferences, Add-ons tab here and search for the DAZ to Blender bridge. Make sure that it is turned on by enabling the checkbox. Finally, we have everything downloaded and installed. Now you should be ready to begin using the bridge. In the DAZ Studio, I will add a character to the scene that I will be transferring into Blender. Any Genesis 3, 8, or 8.1 figure should do. I also add shorts to hide nudity for the YouTube. And that is it, it should be ready to be transferred now. Just make sure that the character is selected. Usually, you would go through the File, Export path. But with the bridge, you instead need to go to the Scripts, Bridges, Blender, DAZ to Blender. A window appears with some transfer settings available here. Leaving everything as it is for now and click Accept. Wait for the export and you are done. Time to proceed to the Blender. To access the add-on here, you need to open the side panel. It can be done by either pressing the N key on your keyboard or by clicking on this arrow on the side of the viewport. When the side panel is open, we can access the DAZ to Blender tab from it. Here are all the add-on settings. Right now we only need to press the Import New Genesis Figure button. After a bit of time, the import is finished. The figure has been transferred to Blender successfully. though it is inside the default cube. It is because we did not clean the scene before importing, which is a good thing to remember. Not a problem though, as we can easily delete everything unnecessary. Nothing obstructs anymore. The most noticeable thing is all the different shapes around the character. Those are bones and we will look at them closely a bit later. Right now I want to look at geometry and talk about subdivision levels. Subdivision levels was one of the settings that we can use when exporting the figure from the Daz Studio. It controls the amount of geometry the figure would have when imported in the Blender. When I enter the edit mode, we can then see the geometry of this figure. And if I also turn on statistics, we will see the exact amounts too. Frankly, this is not a lot of geometry and it can be too low poly for some people. So back in Daz Studio, while exporting the character with the bridge, you can increase the subdivision level setting to allow more details exported. This way, export from Daz Studio takes longer, as it is more geometry. Opening a new scene and cleaning it to bring the new figure. Same way, the import takes quite a bit longer now. Looking at the geometry of this character, we can clearly see that there is a lot more of it. Statistics tell us that this is around 10 times as many faces as it was before. This means that this figure has a lot more geometry to work with and can be much more detailed. But it is a trade-off, as more geometry indicates that it needs more power from your computer to be handled. This means that this figure will impact overall performance much more than the previous one. For example, rendering it will take a lot more time. So for the sake of this video, I will be using subdivision level 0 all the time. But nothing stops you from increasing it. Besides, there is a level 1 option, which is in between levels 0 and 2. Back to the initial character and all these shapes around it. As we already established, this is a rig of the character that is made of bones. They are represented differently, as these shapes should be easier to work with. If I go into the edit mode, then you can see all these bones in their default look. Rig and bones are there for posing a character, so let's do just that by changing into pose mode. Now we can select bones and transform them. Let's take this shoulder bone as an example. When it is selected, we can see that there is a gizmo around it. Red and blue lines drawn on the dome-like shape. This gizmo represent limits, we will explain them more later. To change the pose of the bone, usually, you would rotate it. It can be done by pressing an R key on the keyboard. Rotating on the X-axis moves the hand along the red line on the gizmo and Z-axis does the same for the blue line. Also, you can use the rotate tool for this, the axis on the tool match those on the gizmo. Notice how I can't move the hand out of the limits. When I try rotating past the gizmo, it does not let me. This is how limits work. They will contain all transformations in a specific area. This way it is much easier to create a believable and realistic pose. Though not every bone has this gizmo attached. Usually, this indicates that this bone cannot be transformed on the X and Z axis. But instead, they should be rotated on the Y axis. Knowing all this, you can go through the rig and pose the character however you want. This even covers such parts of the figure as eyes, ears, and even more. By the way, you always can turn off the limits by selecting the bone and going to the Bone Constraint Properties tab. Here we see all the limits and can turn them off or on at any time. Then, you will no longer be restricted by anything. But this way, it is much easier to mess up the pose and create something like this. So I will recommend them turned on in the most cases. Instead of transferring a regular character and then posing it in Blender, you can apply a pose beforehand. For this in Daz Studio, apply a pose to the character. It can be any pose that you want. After that, transfer the character. As usual, no need to do any additional steps. And here we have it, the figure has been transferred into Blender with a pose already applied. One of the very important questions that we did not yet answer is, what about materials? Did they transfer successfully? This is very important, so let's turn on the material preview shading and take a look. Takes some time, but all materials do appear. Looks very good, there are no problems with the materials at all. Everything looks as expected. If you ever used previous Daz to Blender Bridge versions, you may know that this used to be a problem. Now material transferring is in much better shape. We can use different lighting options and see that it looks good in all of them. To learn more about materials, we should open the Material Properties tab. Here, we can see all the materials that are attached to our character. Looks very similar to the Daz Studio. Under Surface, we can also see that these materials use a unique Iray and Cycles skin shader. Until now we just used a material preview shading, which is not as good as the main rendering engine. So let's look at this scene when rendered with Cycles. This is still just a preview and not a full render, thus a lot of noise. But we still can see that materials look as they are supposed to, nothing problematic on the scene. What if we make it more difficult for Blender? I will go back to the Daz Studio and change materials here. A different skin material applied to the character. And new material for the shorts. Only now I will transfer this character to the Blender. And let's take a look at how materials did. Pretty good. I would say a little bit worse than the default skin, but it is still good. The next step is editing these materials. We already know that Material Properties is the tab that we need. Here, we can select any part of the character and edit its material. For example, I will take body. I plan to make it less shiny, as I think that it is too much. So I will open Specular Lobe Roughness and increase it. In the same way, I also decrease Dual Lobe Specular. This makes the body look a lot less shiny and reflective. But this way of editing materials has a huge problem. We have only changed the body part. So if we want to also change other parts, we need to manually go through each one of them and try to match the values for them. This is very tedious and not very practical. Thankfully, there is another way of handling this situation. In the Daz to Blender Bridge settings, there is a section dedicated to changing material. So here I have color hue selected, and when I press down, it decreases the hue value for the whole character. Now the figure is purple. There is a list of values here and this works with any of them. I wanted to make the character less shiny, so I select roughness and increase it. Be careful, as you can reset the value by mistake like this. Now I change the specular value. Maybe I even add a little bit of saturation to this. And here we have it, exactly what I wanted and much easier than editing materials manually. Before the Daz to Blender Bridge, or instead of it, people have used another way of transferring. Let's test it out and see whether Daz to Blender Bridge is better than the previous method and compare them. Going to File, Export. In this window, I need to select the file format that I want to be used. As I want to transfer the character, its rig, pose, and material, then the .fbx file format would suit me best. Give it a name and save the file. In the next window, there are a lot of export options. They are set to optimal values, so I leave everything as is. Export is done, now I prepare the scene in Blender. Import is also a bit different, as I need to use File, Import, FBX this time, instead of Bridge. There are different import options on Blender too, but I don't change them for now. Here we have the result. Yeah, it is quite terrible. There is basically nothing right with this figure. The rig is all over the place, the pose is butchered, clothes float in the air, and so on. Materials are not as bad, but still, nothing to be proud of. There is no unique shader added to, materials use regular BSDF shader. For some reason, skin materials are set to being metallic and also quite reflective. Changing these values makes it look a bit better, but still not good. On our website, we have a DAZ to Blender article, in which we introduced exporting characters into Blender. I will follow the export method for .fbx files from this article and see whether it works better. Here is the result of this export. It is clearly much better than before, but it is still quite terrible. I can try to manually fix this pose, but it is not easy, especially as there are no limits on the bones. And materials did not import any different, they were still metallic and reflective for some reason. Overall, it is not an argument even that DAZ to Blender Bridge is on another level. Everything about .fbx transferring is worse and I can't see why anyone would use it over the bridge. So let's go back to working with Bridge. For now, we have only transferred the figure itself, but what else can you export? We will start with the figure assets. By that, I mean everything that is connected to the figure in some way. We already saw clothing items being transferred with the shorts example. Let's create a character and add something more complicated like this Newport outfit. Note how it is made for another figure, Genesis 2 male. Another asset is the hair. You can also add different props to the characters. For example, a weapon. It is not posed ideally, but it does not matter, as we are just testing transferring. I also change a pose to something that we did not try yet. Everything that we added is a part of the character now. And finally, I export it. As for regular already, importing figures into Blender. We can see clothes, hair, and a blade. Though, in the material preview, there are some problems to be seen. For some reason, hair material is not as it is supposed to be at all. This is just a bug and we can't do anything about it except manually fix materials. Another thing that we see is all the tearing on the pants. As they were not designed for this character, they do not fit too well and skin pokes through them in some places. Thankfully, we can use Blender modeling capabilities to easily hide this problem. Just like this, it can be fixed. Assets are understandable. The next important thing that can be transferred is an environment. Any of these should do. I chose the free level 19 environment. Looks like this. Now export it the same way you do with the characters. Add-on should automatically detect that this is an environment and export it as such. If not, it will ask you to clarify what are you exporting. In Blender, This time, instead of pressing the Import New Genesis Figure button, we need the Import New Env Prop 1. Well, it did transfer, but for some reason, it is rotated like this. This happens to every environment with the current bridge build. Hope that it will be fixed soon. Not a big problem, as I can use these bones to rotate the environment for 90 degrees. Also, edit mode can be used, which I do for this part of the environment. So a little bit buggy, but it works just fine. And when material preview is on, we see that all the materials did get imported without any problems. Moving on. Last but not least are animations. They also can be transferred. I have prepared a character, now I will just add animation to them. Any one of these should work. Now it has been applied as Ani block. Plays out fine. But if I will export it like this, the animations would not be transferred. This is because you can't transfer Ani block animations, you need it to be a keyframe animation. Not a big problem at all. Just select your Ani block and right-click anywhere in the Animate, then select Bake to Studio Keyframes. It will be automatically transferred into a keyframe animation. It works, and now we can transfer it. The important thing not to forget to turn on the Include Animation Data option. Otherwise, you will export the character without any animations. In Blender, the import process is as usual, nothing changed. Here we have our character. We also can see on the timeline all the orange diamonds. Those are keyframes that we transferred from the Daz Studio. They store animation data, and we can press play to see the whole animation. Works exactly as it did in Daz Studio. The next topic I want to touch on is the reasons to use Blender. As you may wonder, why would you even transfer your figures and assets? What does this bring to the table for you? The first and the main thing is the modeling capabilities. Blender thrives in the modeling field, and it is very comfortable to work with geometry here. You can easily edit anything and change the overall look of the character. Then there is sculpting. It is another way of editing the geometry of your characters. Sculpting allows you to use a huge selection of brushes to edit the geometry of your character. This fits perfectly for creating organic shapes, such as people, clothes, and so on. Next is something that we already talked about, posing. Overall, posing in Blender is quite convenient and enjoyable. And thanks to the limits provided by the bridge, it is much easier to work with the rig and create a believable pose for the character. As posing is good, then this means the same for animations. After all, animations are just a lot of poses going one after another. Working with keyframes is easy enough. I can just delete them, move over, and so on. Besides, Blender has some quite advanced animation tools that propose a lot more than a regular timeline. There are also a lot of additional stuff that you can do in Blender, including UV editing, texture paint, compositing, post-production, and so on. One of the most important things for a lot of people would be rendering. We will be doing a small test to compare the rendering capabilities of both programs. The goal was to create two identical scenes in Daz Studio and Blender using the Daz to Blender bridge and then use it to compare renders. Here is the scene that I am going to work with. It is a level 19 environment that you already familiar with. A Victoria 8.1 model with dark storm outfit applied. For lighting the scene, there is a 3-point lighting setup. So here I have a backlight, a fill light, and a key light. On this channel, we have an Iray lighting tutorial, where I have already explained the 3-point lighting technique. Obviously, we also have a camera on the scene. The aspect ratio is 3:4, as you can see now. Besides the 3 lights, there is also an HDRI applied to the scene to produce some ambient lighting. This would be an HD image resolution-wise. The main rendering engine that we are going to test today is the NVIDIA Iray engine. Additionally, there is also a Filament engine that we will look at, as Blender also has 2 rendering engines. Now for the Blender. I have transferred the same scene here in the best way that I could. Same level 19 environment, character, assets, and lighting. Though transferring lighting was not an easy thing, as there is no option in DAZ to Blender bridge for the lighting or cameras, at least not yet. If we look at the power setting of lighting, in Blender it is measured in watts, while in DAZ Studio, it is lumens instead. Matching all other settings was easy, as there are settings for color, shape, size, and spread in both programs and they are identical. There is no proper way to convert DAZ Studio lumens into Blender watts. So what I ended up doing is dividing the lumens value in DAZ Studio by 10,000 and using this result for watts. For example, key light has 2 million lumens. Divided by 10,000, this gives us 200, which I have used in Blender. So I did this for every light. This is not ideal, but I found it to give a very close result, so I am fine with it. By the way, DAZ Studio also has a temperature setting that is not present in Blender. So I have compensated that with the color of the light in Blender. Oops. Seems that the size did not match for the backlight. But it is an easy fix. Other than that, seems supposed to be nearly identical, including the HDRI that is applied in both programs. Regarding the render settings, I will be rendering the Iray image for exactly 10 minutes or 600 seconds. This is because Iray can seemingly render for an almost infinite time. So I have specified the exact time for rendering instead. This is the resulted render. In 10 minutes, Iray managed to render 310 iterations, which seems enough as there is no problem with the noise. Remember how the shoulder pads and boots look, as we would compare that to Blender. Speaking of Blender, in it, I have set the same resolution for the render and thus aspect ratio. For rendering, I will be using its main realistic rendering engine, Cycles. Rendering with Iray and Cycles is very different from one another. You can't render Cycles for a set amount of time, and I can't just set it to 310 samples, as Cycles samples and Iray iterations are not the same things. Instead, I will try to manually match the number of samples, so it would render for approximately 10 minutes. And of course, I will be using GPU for rendering this. Here we see what was the result of this. In the end, this has produced 600 samples in 10 minutes and 26 seconds. So a few seconds longer than Iray, but 600 samples is not a low amount. Look at the side-by-side comparison here. Renders are very similar, but at the same time different. The most noticeable things are hair, shoulder pads, and boots. They look very different, and this is just how it is because this is how materials transferred. Though I am sure it can be fixed if you want to. Overall, Iray looks more realistic, down to earth and darker, while Blender is more vibrant and colorful. Time-wise, I would say that the Blender was faster. Nonetheless, it is very hard to compare this, as I already explained that you can't compare samples in Blender to iterations in Cycles. But at least because Blender can utilize both your GPU and CPU at the same time, it is probably faster. Iray is infamous for its slow rendering times, so it is not a big surprise, to be honest. Back to the Daz Studio, now let's create a filament render. The obvious problem is that there is no option to render with Filament. You see, the idea for Filament is to be a preview engine, so it is not possible to easily render with it. Though we can use it in the viewport. To be honest, this looks quite terrible. There is a Filament Draw Options node that can be used to change how Filament looks. And I have already used it to produce this result, as the default looked even worse. Another major problem is that lights simply do not work with Filament. No matter where they are located or how strong they are, there is no lighting produced. Overall, Filament is very disappointing at the moment, and there is not much sense in using it at all, especially for rendering. Now for the Blender. Here we will be using the Eevee rendering engine. It has a couple of settings that improve the overall look, that I have turned on here. Eevee is the engine that is used when you use material preview shading in a viewport. So you have probably already seen your scene in Eevee. In the end, I needed to change the lighting a bit for the render, as Eevee is much brighter than Cycles. This was the result after only 30 seconds of rendering. I think that this looks awesome as for the render that was this fast. All in all, Eevee is a very good rendering engine, especially if you want a stylized scene, instead of a photorealistic one. Daz Studio also has one more rendering engine that I did not mention, the 3D Light. It is an old engine that was used before the introduction of Iray. Today it is very outdated and can't produce a competitive image. As we see, it does not look good and the skin texture is missing whatsoever. This is why I did not mention it earlier, it is just no good. This is the end of our small comparison. In conclusion, I would say that Blender has pleasantly surprised me. Even though Daz Studio has a huge advantage here, Blender still managed to produce some amazing results. Especially the Eevee render in only 30 seconds was a surprise. All in all, there are plenty of use cases when you would prefer Blender over the Daz Studio. You can find even more information about this and other 3D design topics on our website, renderguide.com. Here are the best 3D models and tutorials for your render projects, including the Fresh Daz to Blender Bridge tutorial, on which this video was based on. We always produce articles before videos, so visit the website to learn everything as soon as it is possible. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get more inspiration.